so excited for another episode of Lifestyle Business on LPTV today, and especially excited for our guests. We're going to be having Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton, California, one of our very favorite launchpad cities, and Scott Santens, two of the country's leading thinkers and authors about universal basic income. They're going to be sharing their need for UBI allies and revealing some actual real-life data points on how UBI has helped the people of Stockton and how we can translate those impact and those results to the rest of the country. But before we get started, how are you?
I'm doing great. Also, I'm Chris.
And I'm Ann. And this is Lifestyle Business on Launchpad TV. This is a big show. I feel like we have been talking about universal basic income for a couple years now. Original members of the Yang Gang, that is us. And we started actually back in the day when we were talking to our friend Andrew Yang. We had him at Ecosystem Summit, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he came to Ecosystem Summit last year, in fact, or 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
I think we have a picture of it. Let's see if we can put that up. And shared his platform. There it is.
Ooh.
Let's get out of the way. Shared his platform for his candidacy. At the time, seemed like a kind of a long shot candidacy, and he really made it a long way, all the way through the late primaries this year.
Well, I mean,
and has thrust this topic into
the mainstream.
Into the mainstream,
which is awesome, because if you remember back to that, we were having some beers. I was actually having pineapple juice and soda water because nobody knew it, but I was pregnant with Harper at the time. But as we were having some beers with the guys afterwards, a lot of the conversation was, how do we leverage this presidential run as a way to actually educate on the concept? And then who knew? It's a movement.
Well, one of the things he said, and I'm sure Scott will have some things to say about this since he has been advising him on this, during his run, was, look, I'm either going to win and be president, or this country's going to have UBI. And,
Feels like it's happening.
It feels like we're getting pretty close to that. It's a crucial topic, particularly during this time. In fact, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, yesterday said, look, we got to do more stimulus. We got to get money in the hands of American people. So I think there's a recognition right now that we need UBI. There's a question of whether it's going to be short-term or long-term, but it's amazing how much this topic has progressed over the over the last couple of years.
Both in the last year, this sort of driving and catalyzing kind of the zeitgeist around this, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And what has also been fascinating for us is because, obviously we work in cities across the US. So we often are in, different environments, but this has been a true bipartisan topic. This is something where people who had primarily been Democrat and Republican, they come behind this initiative. And I think that is what has been really interesting about the movement, about what's actually happening. And I think that sort of spawning of activity has been a really interesting discourse that's changed kind of the trajectory of how things have been going when it comes to both UBI and ultimately our presidential election.
Yeah, and I think an important topic, the unemployment rate is sky high right now, unfortunately. We've had to go through some layoffs and furloughs with Launchpad. With these declines in the jobs, one thing that tends to happen
is that what they call it? The declines in the jobs?
Declines. Great. But one of the things that tends to happen with the economy is that the jobs, the economy rebounds each time, but the jobs don't always come back, right? Because of automation, because of efficiencies, because this disconnect in the stock market, right? There's a lot of companies that are doing really well. The Main Street companies, as we've talked about on the show, not so much. But again, is UBI the safety net that we sort of need here? So yeah.
anyway, this is, I mean, and it's exciting. It's obviously a topic that we're going to talk about. But, you know, another one is, so, you know, part of what's been exciting to see in terms of the grassroots movement of Yang Gang has been the willingness to come together in a really open way and actually educate people of all different perspectives, of all different walks of life, educate your friends, your family, all of the pieces there that, you know, it's just fascinating to me to see. And I haven't seen another issue that has catalyzed these topics. But oftentimes when you're having conversations like this, and Scott, we're going to talk to you about some of the challenges that we face in the conversations we have and how you actually help navigate those, because I'm sure you get those questions all the time. But one of the common questions is, where's the data? And again, this is why we're excited to have our friend, Mayor Michael Tubbs, on the call today, because what we're seeing in Stockton, we've been in for almost a year in our location there. And you know, I am continually impressed with the way that city is #reinvent Stockton, constantly on the forefront of pushing an agenda that is supportive and inclusive and challenging the norms and being really innovative. And one of the things that they've done is they've actually done an experiment on UBI. So we actually are going to talk about the data today.
Which is the question that
where's the data
we always get, right?
Where's the data?
I wouldn't want to test something. I wouldn't want to advocate for something unless there's data around it.
Data.
And I'm sure Scott will be able to reveal more data. But Stockton and Mayor Tubbs has been, you know, running this experiment. So will be very interesting to see.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about Stockton is, and one of the things that we're really excited there, is through this year, it's been interesting because I think when we entered the Stockton market, obviously our platform is around kind of empowering entrepreneurship and supporting and activating the entrepreneurial community. It was an exciting place. We launched our foundation in Stockton. We granted our first scholarships to Stocktonian businesses and have welcomed them into the Launchpad community and been supporting them. And by the way, supporting them through the network. So getting mentorship from other locations to actually help and guide them. And there's like one rock star network that I mentor that I'm not allowed to mention because then everybody wants him. But literally on the last call with our recipients, they were like, that guy is the best. And so I think I need to get him to do some coaching for you and I.
Yeah.
And do some mentorship. But in Stockton, it's been fascinating as we've seen COVID-19 hit hard and come fast at us. What I've also seen on the ground there has been just a real desire to dig deep and be super creative and collaborative and all kinds of thought process around it. And things like we just launched the Stockton Strong Marketplace by Good Stock in our downstairs floor.
Yeah.
So thinking about how are we actually building programs in the time of COVID-19, but as it is shining a light on some of the cracks in the economy, it also is giving us this amazing opportunity where we get to actually rethink things and create things from the ground up. So we're really excited about that.
What about masks? Are they wearing masks in Stockton?
They are, I mean, a lot of people are wearing masks. I think everyone's making the personal decision to protect others because, by the way, wearing a mask is about protecting others even more than it is about protecting yourself.
Yeah.
Something like if you are wearing a mask and you have COVID and the other person is not wearing a mask is 70% prevention. And that goes down to 95% or more prevention if both of you are wearing masks. So masks are the way to go.
Yeah.
And yes, there has been some controversy in Stockton around wearing masks, although a big, strong advocate for them.
We'll see what the mayor has to say
our
about
friend,
it.
Mayor Tubbs.
He has strongly recommended that people are wearing masks. All right.
Let's get into it.
I think if Scott Santens is ready, we're going to bring you in first. I think we're having some technical difficulties with Mayor Tubbs at the moment. So Scott, we're going to bring you in and we'll bring the mayor on when he's ready. So I'm going to promote you to a panelist while Ann introduces you.
All right. Acknowledged by Andrew Yang in his book, The War on Normal People, as one of those who helped shape his thinking, and described by historian Rutger Bregman as by far the most effective basic income activist out there. Scott Santens has lived with a crowd-funded basic income since 2016 and has been researching and advocating for the idea around the world since 2013. He is currently serving on the board of directors of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity and is the editor of Basic Income Today, a daily UBI news hub. As of February 2020, he's serving as senior policy advisor to Mike Brohier, in his campaign for U.S. Senate against Mitch McConnell. We can all agree that is a race worth fighting.
Yes, thank you. And hello, Chris and Ann. It's good to see you.
Great to see you.
It's great to see you and great to be back with you. We share a New Orleans connection. Are you in New Orleans at the moment?
I am, yeah. And I'm really actually, I moved just a few blocks from Launchpad now, so I'm actually super close.
Oh, nice.
Great. All right, good.
Oh, honorary member.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, let's get into. We're gonna bring in Mayor Tubbs here in a moment. We just, I think, resolved some of the technical difficulties, and one of the things we wanted to do is have a conversation around UBI that includes his perspective and your perspective. You've been advocating for this for years. I remember when you and I first met, probably 3 or 4 years ago, and you were doing a UBI meetup at Launchpad. This has been you have led this topic into the national consciousness, and Andrew Yang, obviously, you're advising of him, helped popularize it, and all of a sudden it seems like this is actually a tool that is exactly what this country needs right now. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think we actually met for the first time at a Collision, and when that happened. Yeah, I think it was 2014, maybe, or 2015. It was probably 2015, I think. Yeah, but yeah, it was a while ago. And now here we are, and Andrew Yang did an incredible job of really shifting the entire Overton window on this topic, and then of course the pandemic hits and the shutdown happens, and suddenly it makes a lot more sense to people. And I think that I think it helped actually get the stimulus payments out as being like a solution maybe that people were more likely to get behind, I think, sooner. We may have still done it because it's not like, we have done it before. We did it under Bush and Obama, but still it was like this time was framed around this basic income kind of perspective. And I think actually the unemployment boost of $600 per week was kind of seen along these lines too. Even though, as supporters of basic income, we know that it's not about just paying people to be unemployed. It's paying people, to do anything. And I think actually that we're entering another window of discussion possibility with the expiration of the unemployment boost at the end of July, where we can say, hey, do we want to just continue this $600 a week unemployment boost that does nothing for those who are still working and employed, at the same time potentially pays people more to be unemployed? Or do we want to actually create a floor and actually enable people to earn on top of that when they are employed, and make sure that we don't have to actually make people stand in line? And like, did you see the video from just yesterday in Kentucky?
Yeah,
it was just people waiting in line for 10 hours, I think was the total that some people stayed in line for, and they were still turned away, some of them, after waiting 10 hours in line to go to an unemployment office. And so, I mean, this is absurd to be doing, not only just in general. No one should wait in line for 10 hours to prove that they need assistance in a time of mass unemployment, but also this is a pandemic, and that's the absolute thing we don't want, is to have people together in these lines too. It's just like doubly nonsensical to go around this route. And also it just makes so much more sense to get money to people directly instead of through essentially 53 different departments to try to get money to people in different ways in all these different states.
And you make an interesting point about just providing everyone this floor, which, there was the one-time sort of stimulus payment that, was sort of based on, sort of capped out income levels. But one of the things, I was on a Zoom call, a couple, at the beginning of this, and a woman who ran an employment agency was remarking that she's not going to be able to get these workers back to work while these unemployment benefits are there, because they're otherwise making less than they're making more on unemployment than they are if they're not, if they're working. And it just seemed to me like this is the most perverse incentive system. We want people back to work, but we want them to make less than they would make if they were on unemployment. Why not just give people a little bit of a baseline help, let them work if they can, if they're able to, and if they want to. But it just seems like a better system. We're sort of creating these divergent incentives for people through the unemployment system.
Yeah, exactly. People traditionally think, when they hear about basic income, they think, oh, that's a disincentive to work. And it's providing money to people if they're unemployed is not a disincentive to work. It's that you take it away from them when they accept employment. Like that's the disincentive to work. If your choice is, to earn $1,000 per month or to earn $1,000 per month in earned income from a job, how are you better off by accepting that job? But if you can double your income by accepting the job, then that is an incentive. And that's the thing, is that UBI actually moves the incentive to employers. If it's up to the employers to make the jobs attractive to employees to accept. Another thing too is it's really interesting to see how we acknowledged that the existing unemployment system was not reaching freelancers and the entrepreneurs and gig workers. Yeah, under the existing systems. We invented the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which is a different thing, and that's like all these numbers for them are different from the full unemployment numbers. And I've seen too that with that, we of course know that as say a freelancer and you're self-employed, your incomes are going to vary a lot depending on what you're able to do and the jobs that you're able to get. And so for them, like if you're getting $2,000 per month in this assistance and your income varies a lot and it can be, $400 or $1,000 something dollars or whatever, then yeah, as Ann was saying, it like that, I think is even a worse disincentive than usual, because that makes so much more sense for you. It's so much safer. And, that's your guaranteed income for this time. That you wouldn't get otherwise. So yeah, just build a floor and make sure that it empowers people to do the work that is available to them, and also make sure that we feed into the economy, because seriously, around so much of the stuff we're seeing around us is a problem of a lack of demand. Like if you're not able to spend money, a third of American weren't able to pay their housing payments last month or this month. And so, if you can't pay your housing payments, how are you supposed to go to your local restaurants? How are you supposed to do anything in your local economy? And when you do that, then it loses more jobs. So, I mean, we're in the spiral and we have got to break out of it. And it just makes more sense just to make sure people have the money to spend.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to go a lot further on the topic, and I want to get into a lot about how we pay for it and all sorts of things. But let's bring in Mayor Tubbs right now. He's been running an experiment, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, and you might even have some questions from Scott. So I'm going to bring in Mayor Tubbs, and Ann, why don't you give him
I'll give him a little shout out, right? Mayor Tubbs, delighted to have you. Upon taking office in January of 2017, Michael Tubbs became both Stockton's youngest mayor and the city's first African-American mayor. He is also the youngest mayor in the history of the country, representing a city with a population of over 100,000 residents. Included in Fortune's 2018 Top 40 Under 40, Forbes 2018 list of the 30 Under 30, and the Roots 100, Tubbs' leadership paired with an ambitious agenda received national recognition. We are proud members of the Stockton community and delighted to be friends with Michael, and have been just completely, I can't believe it's only been since January 2017. inspired by the amount of work you, your team, and others have done to really do a big transformation in that city, and to be on the front lines of advocating. So we will get into some of the things we're doing in COVID-19 fallout with you, but we're just talking a little bit about the Stockton Economic Empowerment demonstration that you took. And I think one of the things that we were excited to hear from you, Michael, was the idea around, you've got the data on these kind of experiments. You've been a first believer in UBI, and we'd love to hear some of the stories from the ground on how UBI has been a stimulus and not just a safety net.
Well, absolutely. Well, first, so good to see you guys.
And new dad,
too, Michael.
Wishing we were at the Launchpad office in Stockton having this conversation, but someday soon.
Yeah.
And Scott, thank you for the knowledge and like this, the way you've been doing public education for the past several years. I know you must be excited at how what was just a crazy idea not too long ago is now becoming something that's very mainstream. And before I answer your question, just building off the conversation you all were having, I think what COVID-19 has really illustrated, at least for me in terms of a compelling argument, is that we live in a time of pandemics. So it's not fair to treat kind of COVID-19, its response, as a one-time thing. But because next year will be some sort of earthquake, next year will be some sort of hurricane. We're supposed to have the worst hurricane season ever. So we're living in a time of pandemics, and something like an income floor helps build resilience and should be part of the conversation, because we're going to have to keep doing it, because there will be massive disruptions. That's just the time we live in. And I didn't realize that until kind of COVID-19. I was like, well, wait, next year will be something else, the year after will be something else. So as you mentioned, we've been piloting with our Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, where 125 families have been given kind of direct cash, $500 a month for, I can't believe it was 18 months, for the past 18 months. We're recently lucky enough, thanks for donation, to extend the pilot to January.
Yeah.
And I say, but even over the past 18 months, even the way some of my colleagues talk about what people deserve has changed. Everyone's not there in terms of just giving people cash, but my council colleagues are like, we need to give people rental assistance during this time. We need to give small businesses grants with no restrictions. So getting closer to the idea that you can trust people to make decisions and have the agency to do what's appropriate for them and their families. And what we've heard particularly during this time is that the $5 has been such a lifeline for people who've been laid off because of COVID-19 and have bills due and couldn't wait the 6 weeks or a month it takes to get on unemployment. People who, one of our recipients actually contracted COVID and was unable to, but got it early on. So no one knew what was wrong with her, but she couldn't work for like six weeks. And then she was diagnosed. It couldn't work for 2 weeks after that. And she talked about the $500, and she works hourly with no sick leave really. So the $500 was enough for her to at least be able to pay for some bills and not kind of start off even further behind than when she started. And I think for me, it's made me hot to like fuego on the idea, because so many people, again, and before there was a COVID-19 pandemic, as you all know, there was a economic pandemic. Like a lot of Americans were struggling to make basic necessities, to pay for an emergency, to respond to life events. And last thing in terms of data, for the data nerds out there, you can go to stocktondemonstration.org. There's a whole pretty dashboard built by researchers who are a lot more knowledgeable about this than me, that looks at spending data month by month by month for the focus and the control group. And what's fascinating for me is that all of the way the money is spent makes sense, because like how I spent money the past month, like on food, on utilities, on a Mother's Day gift, like things like that. I mean, what we found in COVID-19 is that food expenditures actually went up to almost 45% of how the money was spent, when before it was between like 30 and 35, showing that people being very rational said we have to shelter in place, let's make sure food is stocked so we can actually stay safe in COVID. So just blabbering now, but absolutely, I think that the time has come to just ensure that everyone in this country has an economic floor. Juneteenth is tomorrow. Now, we might have Dr. King talking about this in 67. And I think what's interesting to me about that is in 67 was another time of civil unrest in this country, where urban communities, major metropolises and cities were literally on fire, and there were uprisings and protests because people were really sick of kind of the structural violence and police brutality. And voila, into 2020, we're having the same things happening today. And again, I think one of the solutions, just like Dr. King said that so long ago, has to be some sort of basic income, some sort of income floor, just to allow people the chance to create a foundation to build upon and to make their work go further.
I think it's interesting right now, as we are in this sort of national pandemic, it's shining a light on these issues, right? That we've all been sort of on the front lines trying to get into the national discourse. And so it's easy to understand why a floor makes sense in a crisis situation. But I also think what's been interesting about the exercise that Stockton has done is that it shows that when not in crisis, that basic floor actually does the work to stimulate the economy, right? And I remember there's a great story of a dad who is part of the program who used that $500 to get tutoring for his kids and give them kind of a better supplement to their overall education, or he was putting it into his 401k because he was giving himself the idea for a bigger, better future. And so I think that resilience is not just about how do we solve for the cracks in the moment of crisis, because that's, I mean, PPP, everybody has money and they're spreading it all around, especially for the big guys. But when you really get down to it, in times of good time, this basic income is helping our economies in cities, and cities like Stockton, where we have larger vulnerable populations, that even in good times, this is a way for us to actually start to spawn. So, you know, I'd love to hear Mayor Tubbs, you comment on that.
Yeah, you made the point. So I tried to make that point. I didn't do it as artfully as you, so I'll try again. But I was saying that I feel like
You and I are a good team.
A lot of people, particularly like communities like Stockton, were living in economic conditions that I would argue were pandemic-like conditions anyway, before COVID-19. And that's a lot of people in our country. And also, I would just add, I think part of the demonstration has also taught me how particularly women do all type of things that are work that isn't compensated in the labor market, like domestic labor, child rearing, et cetera. That for a lot of women who work the minimum wage or retail jobs, it actually makes more sense to not go to work, but to stay home and take care of your kids because childcare is so high. It's actually a rational. So, and if they're doing it for somebody else, it would be a job. And that's really opened my eyes. But what we've seen from the folks in the program is that the $500 has been a lifeline to opportunity. It's been a way for them to do things like get their dentures fixed, has been a way for them to pay for football camps for their kids, has been a way for them to buy food to cook Thanksgiving dinner for their entire families. Actually, I was at Men's Warehouse 4 months ago, and a white family was looking at me. So my wife went over and said, "Hey, you want to take a picture?" And they said, "No, we're part of the basic income demonstration, and we just want to tell them thank you." And then the wife came to me and she said, "With this month's money, we're buying his tux for our wedding." And for some people, like, that's not a necessity. You know, that's the best story ever, because I think part of it is that it allows people to be human and to experience the full range. I think Gene Sperling, has this book about economic dignity and about kind of one of the functions of the economy or having cash is to be able to enjoy life's moments, like a wedding, and not be stressed or anxious about those. So the fact that they were able to go to Men's Warehouse, rent a tuxedo for a wedding, and she said, without this money, we would not be able to do that. That just made me feel incredible, because I think that's part of this as well. It's about how do you allow people to feel the full range of human emotions and to treat life's big events not with stress or anxiety, but excitement and the ability to fully partake. And last story, there's a one gentleman, Tomas, who was working an hourly job. And he told me, he said that $500 was enough for him to interview. And I was very confused. I said, well, why are you paying $500 per interview? That's what everyone's talking about. We're using this money on scams. Like, no, Tomas, it's not going to work. And he laughed and he said, no, I work retail, which means I work hourly, which means I don't get time off. So the $500 was enough for me to take time off so I could interview for a better job, which I received, that has less hours, a stable schedule, and benefits. And that's just such a great story, because it highlights how a lot of people are working without kind of the dignity of a set schedule or paid time off. And how a lot of people aren't able to be entrepreneurial and take risks. because they don't have at least a small kind of foundation. I think that's what the basic income demonstration of the past 18 months has really taught me. It's really about sort of our society being angel investors in all of us and giving all of us kind of the launch pad, if you will, or the space to try, to test, to interview, and things of that sort.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think that's exactly right. In your comment about, you know, economic dignity, you know, we talk about, you know, agency a lot in sort of the entrepreneurial journey of actually, you know, being able to choose a path that that you want to take. So I want to shift, and Scott, maybe you'll have a comment on this, because Mayor Tubbs, obviously with a program in a city or state, at a state level, you know, the budgets, there's not a budget locally to pay for something like this, and it's a great experiment. But for this to work on a broad scale, it has to be done sort of by the federal government. So, you know, probably the biggest question I get, Scott, is how do you pay for this, right? How do you, you know, where does this come from? You know, is it realistic to give every American $500 a month or $1,000 a month, which was Andrew Yang's proposal? So just that, how do we pay for it?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, I just also like to frame this kind of question as asking, how much does it cost to not have a basic income? You know, is poverty free? Like, what is the cost of this? And I think that when you do start to look at that, like, what is the cost of not having a basic income? It exceeds the cost of having a basic income. The cost of child poverty alone is over $1 trillion a year, and that's only child poverty. So just keep that in mind. And then also, we already have you know, so many programs that are trying to reach people. I think TANF is a good example. Like, we actually provide money to states in order for them to figure out how that is supposed to get to people. And a lot of that money actually doesn't reach people in poverty, and it certainly doesn't come in the form of cash. And so if we're doing these things already, and then it just makes sense to do it unconditionally instead of doing it conditionally. And then you also look at the, you know, the middle of the income earners, and also the higher income earners too. They're receiving something as well through tax expenditures. We actually have $1.5 trillion in tax expenditures that we do here in the U.S. every year. And 17% of that goes to the top 1%. So we're actually providing, let's say, essentially $30,000 instead of being a check. It's like a discount for someone who's wealthy to buy a mansion to save on their mortgage. And we just look at that and go, you know, oh, we like, why don't we ask how much it costs to help like the rich afford mansions? You know? But we do that. So like, let's actually just make sure that, okay, we're doing all this stuff conditionally. Let's just remove those conditions and make sure that it's a flat universal amount to everybody. And then if you do it that way, then sure, like, there really does not cost as much as people think it does. And also, it's the net cost instead of the gross cost too. So like, does it cost, let's say, $12,000 to provide someone $12,000 if they paid for it? Like, you know, if your taxes are $12,000 and you're getting that back, the net is zero. You're essentially paying for your own taxes. So everyone actually over the threshold point in any UBI system as a net payer, there's no cost to provide that. You have to figure out the cost is actually subtracting how much people are paying to receive their basic income from their basic income. And so the net cost of basic income is more like, say, $300 to $900 billion, depending on how the design and stuff that you want to do for the UBI, versus the typical kind of $4 trillion kind of price tag costs people calculate by doing, you know, number of people by the amount of UBI. So it's actually quite affordable, especially if you look at the net cost and also the fact that not having it is hugely expensive.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned sort of the unconditionality of it, or just removing conditions. I'm wondering if we can try to draw a little bit of a connection to if when we've talked about social programs like this, we've used charged language before that, you know, sort of in this time of almost like, awakening to racial, prejudice in institutional structures that we have in this country, right? We talk about, welfare queens, and we talk about giveaways, and we talk about, and this is just, removing the conditions is actually, it's not, a nanny state where we have to protect people from themselves, like you're going to go to the grocery store and just buy beer with it, right? Which is the way, we've used that language when we've talked about, welfare or social programs like this. So, I wonder if there's sort of that context to it as well, that by giving it to everyone and, not making it something that, is just, there's sort of this,
you take the stigma out of the stimulus.
Yes.
That's exactly right. You take the stigma out of it and you treat it as, dignity and, economic dignity, and you remove that unconditionality from it.
Well, you remove the ability for others to use language to charge the conversation, right?
Right.
And I think that continues to be a problem when you talk about these programs. Is a very white privileged perspective, especially the ones buying mansions, that are like, well, all you have to do is pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and work real hard, and then you can have a beautiful mansion like me. And we all know that, like, the access points, the on-ramp to entrepreneurship, the agency, the ability to get a job, the ability to drive wealth creation, that's dictated, at birth by the opportunity and the privilege that you come in. And I think this is, by taking that piece out and making it universal, it kind of allows us to take the stigma away from it.
It's bringing people up to a starting line. Mark Morial was on this show last week from the Urban League, and one of the things he asked us, and he said, this is a way to think about white privilege, or privilege for anyone, but this is privilege. Were your parents able to help you pay for college? Or if you would have gone to college, did you just have debt? And the next thing that helps create generational wealth for people is buying their first house. And were your parents able to help you with a down payment for your first house, which is the biggest hurdle to home ownership? So, this is a tool that essentially just, like we're saying, it brings up that floor, right? There's more, everybody gets closer to a starting line that is equitable for across the board, right?
Yeah. I mean, unconditionality is power. By applying conditions, you actually remove people's power. And I mean, that's arguably why we don't even have basic income yet. It was actually the chair of the Senate Finance Committee back in the 70 and 71 that prevented it from getting through to the Senate. He was worried. His question was, who will iron my shirts? If people actually had this guaranteed income. And so that goes to show, like so much of this exploitation going on around us is due to this lack of power, this lack of ability to refuse the conditions people are imposing. Say, all the powers in my court as an employer, I'll pay you minimum wage, and it's, say $8 in this state, so take it or leave it. And if you have an unconditional floor, then you can say, look, I don't need your $8 an hour. I'll do it for $15 an hour if that's the offer. And that's what people could be afraid of, is that they want to actually keep wages down. They want to keep people down in this lack of power. And I think that's also why racial justice and economic justice are so inextricably intertwined. And Dr. King absolutely recognized that. That's why he started pushing in that direction with the basic income back then. And yeah, when it comes to stigma, there is no stigma to the Alaska dividend in Alaska. Everyone sees it as their rightful share. And, when no one sees a stigma to Social Security when you turn 65 or whenever you start accepting it, you don't say, oh, I'm like a horrible person, I'm accepting Social Security. Like, no, that's just not how it works. So yeah, if you universalize something, remove the conditions, you remove the stigma. And I think that's extremely important. And it's also why you see, like, say, increases in trust. And I don't know, it's actually something you've been looking at too, Michael, in Stockton, is measuring trust, because trust has increased in Finland, trust increased in the Ontario experiment. trust increases in other places too. And that's part of it, is you're saying, look, I trust you. It's we're so used to, politicians ask us for money and we're supposed to trust them to use it. And why does it work the other way? Why don't they trust the people in order to use the tax money too? So yeah, it's trust means no stigma, and that means power too.
Michael, have you been seeing results of that, or can you talk a little bit about kind of your perspective on that in Stockton?
Yeah, so one of the research, to your point, Scott, one of the research questions does look at sort of, I don't know if trust is the word, but it's like feelings of efficacy towards government, because to the point Scott raised, it's most people's interactions with government is negative. Like you're paying something, you owe something, you're being punished, you got a ticket, you got to go pay your water bill. It's just never like I see you, you're doing well. Here's a reward. Here's a thank you for being part of our government. And what I found anecdotally is like randomly at different city events, from the state of the city to like feeding people at the food bank, I always run into someone who's part of the basic income pilot. And it feels like they feel seen and feel important and feel part of like something. So now they're giving back more, or that plus they have more time to give back more because they're not working every single waking hour of the day. So that's been just fascinating to see them become more civically involved. And one recipient, unbeknownst to me, so Suki was like, she's actually one of our recipients. She sent a letter in when we were discussing tenant protections, about the need to have stronger tenant protections. And she had never written to a city council meeting before, had never paid attention to a council agenda, but because the mayor, she was in the mayor's program, she became very interested in what was happening in the city at writ large. So I think what's also important about a basic income, particularly in this moment, it's really about reaffirming sort of the social contract and extending that and letting people feel like they feel in Alaska. This is part of what it means to be an American. This is part of our social contract, and that we have this reciprocity where we deserve it, and using that, I think it will increase kind of trust of government institutions, and also feeling like I need to be a part, I need to do something, I need to pay it forward. Because I think without mandating or saying you have to do that, because when we first started, people were like, you should tie it to service. You should say you can be part of this program if you serve. I was like, no. And what we found is that people are serving when they can and how they can, because they have such a good feeling about being part of something that's actually helping their lives, and it's actually not them talking to a case manager every week for checking in.
That to me, like, I think so often when we're talking about these issues, we end up getting into a debate around the philosophy or the policy, or, well, shouldn't everyone just have a job, or maybe we should just improve I personally love we should get everybody to work on roads and infrastructure. Like that's a real thing. And I think it's very frustrating. You end up in these debates, you're educating through logic and argument and things like that. And I feel like sometimes we miss the fundamental basic approach about this, which is like, this is a chance for us to inspire pride in our cities and pride in ourselves, and have that relationship where all of a sudden people feel it's not about a welfare check. This is about an opportunity, and the government is doing something net positive to you. And maybe you do want to keep it on the local level so that they think like Mayor Tubbs wrote me a check for universal basic income and not Donald Trump, right? They're like, hey, this is about my community, but this is a way to activate. And I think that's what's been cool about, as we watch the growth of the Yang Gang, is like, you're seeing people from all walks of life, from all political parties, from all parts of the country coming together and saying like, this is actually really logical. This actually makes sense. This is something that where across the dinner table at Thanksgiving, where we used to be pitted against each other and fighting, we actually now can agree on a common theme. And I feel like we always miss that sort of that moment of aspiration that comes from building that floor or from implementing these systems. And yeah. I love that story.
I think also it's I mean, this is a recognition of all the unpaid work that's going on too. You know, this idea that, oh, you have to do some kind of service in order to get something. that's actually as subscribing to what's kind of called the male model of poverty, where like, you know, we're arguing as men that say women need to do more, you know, jobs or something, and not recognizing that women actually are already doing work. Like we need to start recognizing all the work that's already being done, just from everybody all over. And you know, like if retirees, someone who starts receiving Social Security, it's not like they stop doing everything. Like, no, they're actually able to do, like we said, civic engagement, volunteering in communities, actually doing care work too. And, you know,
Unfortunately, driving for Uber.
it's about recognizing that work is going on and empowering and enabling more of that work. And that's so important.
Yeah.
Okay, we're sort of coming up against time here, so I want to do a couple final topics. But Mayor Tubbs, just turning to you for a minute. We've
got Stockton on our mind.
Yeah, we got, you know, we're excited about Stockton. You were recently named America's most diverse city. You've got a HBO special coming out, I guess in about a month, right? In July. Talk to us about your perspective of sort of the journey of the city and your journey over the last several years. You know, Stockton has really been on the rise, and, you know, at a time like this, I think, you know, we see, okay, America's most diverse city. Like that's actually, that's a badge of honor. That's something that we're trying to achieve as a country. You know, just talk to us about that perspective, and if you can throw any highlights from the upcoming HBO special.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because for so long, Stockton has been ground zero for problems. It's been the place people go to say, we don't want to do that. Or a place people go to say, let's see where they're doing it wrong. From being the largest city at the time before Detroit to declare bankruptcy in 2012, to having a murder rate that per capita was higher than Chicago's in 2011, in 2010. It's been a journey navigating the diversity, not just ethnicities, but also in ideologies. I have 4 Republicans on my city council, for example. And we don't get everything right, and everything is far from perfect. But I do think we're moving forward, and moving forward in a way, as you all have seen from your time in Stockton, that's really rooted in kind of community. So the documentary from HBO, Stockton on My Mind, speaks to that. I was against it at first. I said, I get enough press, let's do something else. But I'm super appreciative of it now because it shows the stories of so many other people in this city, particularly our young people who are kind of living and navigating and trying to make sense of all these changes that are happening locally and nationally. So it talks about it shows some of our basic income recipients and sort of how they're using the money. It shows some of the community dialogue around basic income and how a lot of people were pissed when we started. It talks about some of the other things we're doing with our scholarship program, Stockton Scholars, our violence reduction work. We've reduced homicides by 40% since I started in office. It just talks about how it's being done by normal, everyday, regular people, and oftentimes people who are unlikely, people who have backgrounds, who have family members that are incarcerated or have been incarcerated themselves. And I think particularly in COVID-19 time, it's really been a reminder that in times of crisis, we have to choose community. It's in community, which is a messy word, which is a word that's more of a journey than an actual destination. You don't arrive at community, you strive towards community. But it's in that process, I think we've been able to protect the most vulnerable amongst us. So no, it's been an interesting time, exciting time. And the timing of the HBO documentary is interesting because it's from 2018 to 2019, but the conversations, the characters, the issues seem very, very timely given where we are as a nation today.
Yeah, that's great. Well, good. Well, we're excited. Just let me give you a little plug for it. It's coming out in July 28th. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm terrible. Yes, July 28th on HBO. And then afterwards, it may be just streaming for free for a month. We'll see.
Awesome.
All right, that's great. Well, good. Any
All right.
closing thoughts or?
Closing thoughts.
Yeah. Scott, where can people follow you? You're such a wealth of knowledge on the topic of UBI, and I'm sure some people watching have more questions and would want to follow along. So where can people follow you?
Yeah, people can follow me at scottsantens.com and on Twitter at Scott Santens. And if it's okay, I just wanted to share a quick story to kind of end note this stuff. And this is a real story from the Kenya experiment. And so they're 4 years into their 12-year experiment. And so it's just interesting to see that, Michael is experiencing all this stuff right here in the US. And as human beings, we're very similar all across the world. And so, here in these villages in Kenya, where on the 7th of every month, people just, their phones go off at the same time and they all get money. And like the story that I like is one of the women there gets this, it's around $20. And so on the 7th of the month, gets a $20. She immediately takes some of it, buys a taxi, goes to a local fish marketplace that's a distance away, and buys whatever the local best fresh fish is there. She can with the rest of her money, takes a cab back, and then she makes up and prepares the fish and to sell it to the village that day. And she's able to double her money because of this. And of course, she's able to double her money because all of a sudden you have all these other consumers too. You can't just do that and expect to sell your wares. But that if you come back and you have a village full of people with money burning their holes in their pocket because they just got paid this basic income, then you can do that. And you also see that in this village, everyone has side hustles. And because, this is having that sense of security, and, it takes money to make money, having that bootstraps, you can actually lift yourselves up by, pretend that we can anyways, it enables work. And I think that that's kind of something that we need to realize better, is that, if you want to actually make work possible, then you actually have to have a full stomach. You have to have 2,000 calories a day. You have to have some capital, and you have to have customers in order to make all this possible too.
Yeah,
that's
I think
right.
That's
Yeah.
a great message, and I think that fits really well with our audience. One of the things we talk about here at Launchpad is the idea that Launchpad is really just a platform to support entrepreneurship. And as we look at cities across the country, we know that entrepreneurship is the way forward. Jobs are going away, automation is happening. We're sitting on the front lines in most of these cities. Even a little bit of a floor gives someone the opportunity to create a side hustle, gives someone the opportunity to get that job interview, to try and spend. Maybe it gives them the opportunity to connect and come up with a new way of thinking. And I feel like all of these themes come back into building a much more resilient economy. And we're grateful for the work both of you are doing in your respective areas.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure. I mean, Chris's hero, Scott Santens, was on. My favorite mayor in the country, and I meet a lot of them, Mayor Michael Tubbs. This has been a real treat and delight for us to have you, and we are grateful for your work and grateful for your time.
Thank you, guys. I'm sorry for all the scheduling hiccups the past couple of weeks. It's just been a wild month.
Worth the wait.
Yeah.
Worth the wait, baby.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you, Scott.
Yeah.
Good to see you too, Michael.
All right. Well, want to close us out here?
Yeah, that was a great show. Really important topic right now, and super timely. We're gonna see this could go from sort of a intellectual experiment into something that it's already very prominent and into reality for people and help a lot of people. You heard how it's helping people in Stockton, and so many great stories from Mayor Tubbs. And that was an interesting story in Kenya too. And what I liked about that was it showed it's not just about giving people money to sort of their own needs. It is being angel investors in in our society, in our community, because she took that money and doubled it.
Yeah.
Right. She, you know, that's exactly what we were kind of talking about with Mark Morial. You know, these economic, you know, incentives, it doesn't all need to be VC funding that is gonna create the next unicorn. You know, here you allow a woman to go buy a fish and take 20 bucks and make it 40 bucks and
fits right into our whole discussion on opportunity zones, right?
Exactly.
And the whole idea of getting money moving.
Right.
And small checks matter. And I think we often forget that small checks can have a massive impact.
Right. So enjoyed that show. Thanks so much for everybody tuning in. We will be back on Tuesday next week.
Is that our friends from Caliber?
With Caliber.
That's right. So we are, next Tuesday, we're going to be hosting Chris Loeffler from Caliber, and we're going to be announcing our newest Launchpad location. We might have just leaked it to here. And we're going to be talking to them about inclusive development, placemaking, and the work that they're doing in opportunity zones across the US. And then after that, very exciting show to wrap up June is our member magic show. So we're going to be highlighting some of our Launchpad members, some of the exciting things that they're doing today, maybe some stories of how they've navigated through the COVID-19 crisis. But nonetheless, we're going to wrap up June with a feel-good member magic episode. So thanks for staying with us, and we'll see you next week.
All right. So long, folks.